Andrea Carson had been the CEO of the dealership for 5 years. When she first bought the business, she had poured everything into it, time, energy, and resources, to turn it into a model of excellence. She'd rebranded the entire operation, revamping the showroom, improving the service center, and making sure everyone from the top to the bottom of the chain was paid fairly. It was the kind of place that prided itself on offering friendly service and treating all customers with respect. But recently something had been bothering her. Whispers of dissatisfaction had reached her ears, particularly from minority customers. There were complaints from Black and Latino clients who felt they weren't treated the same as others. At first, Andrea dismissed the rumors. People sometimes misunderstood things, right? Perhaps it was just a series of isolated incidents. But her assistant, Melinda, had come to her with multiple complaints over the last 2 months, all pointing to the same issue. The customers felt like they were being ignored, looked down upon, or simply passed over for service. It wasn't easy to admit, but the complaints started to gnaw at her. Andrea couldn't afford to let it slide. She had worked too hard to build this business on the idea of treating every customer like family, regardless of their background. She wasn't going to let a few bad apples destroy the reputation she had worked so hard to establish. That's when she decided to do something drastic. She'd go undercover, walk into her own dealership dressed as a regular customer, and see firsthand how people were being treated. She needed to know the truth. No filter, no bias. On a quiet morning, Andrea parked her old dusty Ford Ranger just outside the showroom. The truck, a faded blue with chipped paint and duct-taped seats, was nothing like the polished, expensive cars in her dealership's lot. But that was exactly what she wanted. She needed to blend in. The moment she stepped out, no one would suspect she was the CEO. She was wearing a pair of plain jeans, a worn canvas jacket, and heavy work boots caked with dirt. She didn't want anyone to recognize her, and as she walked toward the showroom's entrance, she felt completely anonymous. The engine of her truck ticked loudly behind her as she approached the door. It felt strange, walking in like this, but Andrea's resolve remained firm. She had to know what was going on behind closed doors. Inside, the showroom looked like any other car dealership. Bright lights illuminated shiny vehicles, and there were several customers already browsing. Andrea moved past them quietly, trying to stay unnoticed. No one acknowledged her. She expected it. This was what she wanted. But still, something about the way the staff was interacting with customers stood out to her. A young couple dressed in golf shirts and khakis walked in, and instantly the salespeople flocked to them. "Can I get you a coffee or water?" one of the salesmen asked with a bright smile. He practically rolled out the red carpet for them, offering them every amenity possible as they looked over the vehicles. Andrea continued to observe. Then she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. A young Black man in his 20s, wearing a faded hoodie and jeans, was standing at the door. He was holding a folder, but no one approached him. He stood there for several minutes, glancing around, clearly hoping someone would notice him. But no one did. No one said a word. Andrea's heart sank as she watched him. It was as if he wasn't even there. She could see it in his posture. He wasn't just waiting for service. He was waiting for recognition. And yet no one seemed to care. She couldn't help but compare the two situations. The young couple, lavished with attention, and the young man left to stand in silence. It was as if the color of his skin alone had made him invisible to the staff. Andrea clenched her jaw. This was exactly what she had feared. The disparity was blatant, and it was happening right under her nose. As she moved deeper into the showroom, pretending to inspect a truck, Andrea's mind raced. This wasn't just about bad customer service. This was about a pattern, an unspoken system of bias that had taken root within her business. She had to confront it, and she had to do it now, before it got any worse. She lingered near a silver truck, pretending to check out the price tag. She overheard a conversation between two salespeople. One of them muttered under his breath, "He's just here to look. I bet he can't even afford anything." Andrea froze, her stomach dropping. She had heard enough. She knew exactly what needed to be done. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the front desk, ready to make her presence known. It was time to face the truth, time to confront the very culture she had helped build. As Andrea stood in the showroom, her gaze kept returning to the young Black man, Ezekiel. He was standing by the door, awkwardly holding a folder, glancing around the space as if waiting for someone to approach him. Despite the busy atmosphere, no one acknowledged him. He looked like he was trying to figure out what to do next, but there was no direction, no one offering to help him. Meanwhile, the young couple in golf shirts had just entered the showroom. Instantly, the salespeople surrounded them, all smiles, warm greetings, and offers of coffee or water. One of the salesmen, a tall man with slick-back hair, began discussing the features of the vehicles they were looking at with such enthusiasm that it felt rehearsed. He practically led them to a pristine truck, showing them every detail, pointing out features that were undoubtedly impressive, and even complimenting them on their choices. Andrea couldn't help but notice the contrast. While the couple was receiving VIP treatment, Ezekiel was still standing there, unnoticed and unacknowledged. His clothes weren't as pristine as the couple's, but that was no reason to ignore him. Andrea could sense that Ezekiel felt out of place, as if he wasn't supposed to be there, and the lack of engagement from the staff was only making that feeling worse. She watched closely, her heart tightening with each passing second. This was not just poor customer service, it was a pattern. She could see the underlying issue now. Ezekiel wasn't being treated like a customer at all. The assumption was clear. Because of his appearance, he wasn't worthy of the same attention. He didn't fit the mold of who the dealership staff expected to buy a truck. Ezekiel seemed to gather himself, and after a few minutes of standing there, he took a step toward one of the desks. His movements were hesitant, and Andrea noticed the way he kept glancing at the salespeople to see if anyone would notice him. But no one did. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me, I'm interested in looking at the trucks outside," Ezekiel said, his voice a little unsure. The salesman, a younger man with a disinterested look, barely looked up. "Yeah, they're out there," he muttered without a hint of enthusiasm. "Just go ahead and take a look." The tone was dismissive, almost as if Ezekiel's presence didn't matter. Andrea's stomach churned. She had heard about these types of interactions before, but seeing it firsthand made her sick. It wasn't just that Ezekiel wasn't being given the same level of service, it was that he was being treated as if he didn't belong there at all. Andrea watched as Ezekiel, now clearly uncomfortable, made his way outside to look at the trucks. She noticed that the other customers, like the young couple, were still receiving special treatment. They hadn't even looked at a single vehicle yet, but they were already being showered with offers. Meanwhile, Ezekiel had been brushed off before even getting a chance to ask more questions. The disparity was glaring. Andrea had worked hard to build a business that welcomed everyone, regardless of their background. But now, standing in her own showroom, she could see that the culture had shifted, and not for the better. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice from the back of the showroom. It was the same salesman who had helped the couple. He was chatting with them animatedly, offering them more options and showing them features on a digital screen. But Andrea's attention was no longer on him. It was on Ezekiel, still standing outside, his shoulders slumped. For the first time since she'd walked in, Andrea felt a surge of anger. How had things gotten this bad? How had the culture in her dealership become so warped that people were being judged based on their clothes, their appearance, or the color of their skin? She stood there for a moment, letting the realization sink in. She had been blind to this issue for far too long, but now she had to act. Andrea knew what she had to do. She couldn't allow this behavior to continue, not in her business, not under her watch. It wasn't just about the poor customer service. It was about something much deeper, something that had permeated the very culture of her dealership. She couldn't just ignore it anymore. Andrea took a deep breath as she stepped back from the showroom floor. Her mind was racing. She had just witnessed something that she couldn't ignore any longer. The way Ezekiel had been treated, the clear difference in the attention given to customers based on their appearance. She was angry, disappointed, and frankly, ashamed. This wasn't the dealership she had worked so hard to build. She turned toward the manager's office at the back of the showroom. Andrea had seen enough. It was time to confront her team, and it was time to get answers. She needed to know why her employees were treating some customers with such blatant disregard, while others were being treated like VIPs. As she walked past the rows of cars, Andrea could see a few of her employees stealing glances at her, but no one dared to approach. She wasn't sure if they knew who she was yet, but that didn't matter. She was about to change everything. When Andrea reached the manager's office, she paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. This was going to be tough. She'd built this place with a set of values, values that emphasized treating people with dignity and respect. But clearly, some of her staff had lost sight of that. With a firm knock, Andrea entered the office. The manager, Chris, looked up from his desk, clearly surprised to see her. His eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise with a forced smile. "Andrea," Chris said, trying to hide the discomfort in his voice, "how can I help you?" "I need to speak to everyone," Andrea said, her voice steady but firm. "Now." Chris hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, I'll gather the team." Andrea walked back to the showroom floor and stood near the front desk. A few moments later, the salespeople and other staff began to gather around, whispering among themselves. Some of them were nervous, others confused. None of them knew what was about to happen. "Everyone, listen up," Andrea began, her voice commanding attention. "I've just spent the last hour watching how you interact with customers, and I have to say, I'm extremely disappointed in what I saw." The staff looked around at each other, unsure of what to say. Andrea could see the discomfort in their eyes, but she wasn't about to back down. "I saw a young man stand in this showroom, waiting for help," she continued, her eyes narrowing as she glanced around. "He waited for almost 10 minutes before someone finally acknowledged him. And even then, he was brushed off. Meanwhile, other customers who looked nothing like him, were treated like royalty." She paused, letting her words sink in. "This is not the kind of business I've worked to build. This is not the environment I want to foster here. I want a business that welcomes everyone, no matter their race, their clothes, or their background. But today, I saw something that deeply troubles me, a clear pattern of bias, and I won't tolerate it." There was a moment of silence. Andrea could feel the weight of her words in the air, hanging between her and her employees. She had to say it, even if it was uncomfortable. "I'm not here to point fingers or make excuses," she continued, "but I need to understand why this is happening. Why was Ezekiel ignored while others were given all the attention? Why is this dealership treating certain people differently?" The room was tense now. A few of the staff shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with Andrea. One of the younger salespeople, Tim, finally spoke up, his voice shaky. "Look, we don't mean to—" Tim started, but Andrea cut him off. "No," she said sharply, "don't tell me you didn't mean to. This isn't just a mistake or a one-time thing. I've seen the way some of you have been treating customers for months, and this needs to change now." Andrea's gaze swept over the room, her eyes making contact with each person. She wasn't going to sugarcoat this. If she was going to fix the culture of her dealership, it had to start with a hard truth. "I've built this business on respect," Andrea said, her voice softer but firm. "Respect for everyone who walks through that door. That's the foundation of everything we've done here. If we can't treat everyone with that same respect, then we've lost our way. And I won't let that happen." Chris, the manager, looked at Andrea, his expression conflicted. He started, but Andrea didn't let him finish. "Don't try to defend this behavior," she interrupted. "I'm giving you one chance to make things right. Starting today, I'm going to make changes, real changes. We're going to implement training to address these issues, and every one of you will be held accountable for your actions." The staff shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. Some were trying to avoid her gaze, while others looked unsure about what was coming next. Andrea's eyes locked with Chris's, and for the first time, he seemed to acknowledge the severity of the situation. "I'm not asking for perfection," Andrea said, her tone calm but unwavering. "But I am asking for fairness, and if you can't provide that, then you won't be here much longer." She turned to leave the room, her decision final. She knew this would be difficult. She knew that changing a culture wasn't something that could be done overnight, but this was the first step, and Andrea Carson was committed to seeing it through, no matter how hard it might be. Andrea stood outside the showroom, looking over the lot as the sun began to set. Her mind was buzzing with the conversation she'd just had with her team. She could feel the weight of the responsibility she carried, the heavy task of reshaping the culture within her dealership. But there was no turning back now. She couldn't ignore what she'd seen, and she wasn't about to let it continue. Inside, the employees were still lingering in the showroom, the tension in the air palpable after her confrontation. Andrea knew the road ahead would be rocky. Some of her staff would push back, some would resist. But the culture had to change, and it had to start today. She wasn't going to allow another customer to feel the way Ezekiel had been made to feel. She had worked too hard to let this kind of injustice slide under the radar. With a deep breath, Andrea walked back inside, determined to start making real changes. Her first order of business was the employee training she had promised. She would bring in a consultant, someone with experience in diversity and inclusion, to help her team understand the deep-seated issues that were influencing their behavior. It wasn't enough to just point out the problem. She needed to give them the tools to recognize and combat bias. The truth was, many of them probably didn't even realize they were perpetuating this culture. But Andrea wasn't going to let ignorance be an excuse. When she entered the showroom, she saw Chris, the manager, standing near the sales desk. He looked up as she approached, and she could see the weariness in his eyes. The conversation they'd had earlier had clearly struck a nerve. He was still processing everything, but Andrea knew he had a choice now. He could either join her in this effort to turn things around or let the status quo persist. The decision was his. "Chris," Andrea said, her tone softer now but still resolute, "I need you to step up. This isn't just about firing someone or pointing fingers. This is about the long-term success of the dealership. If we don't address this, if we don't get to the root of this issue, we'll never move forward." Chris nodded slowly. "I get it," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I'll make sure everyone gets on board with the training." "Good," Andrea replied. "And I'm going to need you to be my eyes and ears on the floor. I can't be here every day, but you can help ensure that this culture shift starts with you. It's time for all of us to make a change." She didn't wait for more confirmation. Andrea turned toward the salespeople who were still standing around, unsure of how to respond. The time for speeches was over. Now it was time for action. "Everyone," Andrea called out, her voice firm, "I'm holding a mandatory meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. You will all attend. There will be no excuses. We will go over the new training programs, and we will start taking real steps toward change." She saw a few heads nod, but there were still a few uncertain glances. Andrea wasn't surprised. Changing people's attitudes, especially when they have been ingrained with a certain mindset, wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for the fight. "I'll be working closely with an outside consultant," Andrea continued, "someone who specializes in diversity and inclusion. We'll begin the process of training you all on how to engage with customers fairly and respectfully, no matter who they are or how they look. I want this dealership to be a place where anyone, from any background, feels welcome and valued." The room was still quiet, but Andrea could feel the weight of her words settle into the space. Some of the employees were clearly uncomfortable, while others seemed to be listening more intently now. It was a start, at least. "I'm also implementing a new accountability system," Andrea said, her eyes sweeping over the group. "There will be clear guidelines for how we interact with customers, and if I see this kind of bias again, there will be consequences. We can't just talk about change, we need to live it." Andrea paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. "This is your chance to prove that you can be part of something better, something more inclusive. But if you can't get on board with that, if you can't put in the work to change how you think and act, then you won't be working here much longer. We're in this together, or we're not in this at all." Her words hung in the air, and Andrea knew that this was only the beginning. The hard part was still ahead. The training, the tough conversations, and the ongoing effort to rebuild the dealership's culture. But she had taken the first step, and that was more than enough for now. As the staff slowly dispersed, Andrea headed back to her office. She took a seat behind her desk and stared out the window, her thoughts drifting to Ezekiel. She hadn't forgotten him. She couldn't. She knew she needed to make things right. She had seen firsthand how customers like him were treated, and it broke her heart to think about how many others had experienced the same thing. Andrea knew that it would take time to change the culture of her dealership, but she was determined to see it through. She had built this business on integrity, and now it was time to ensure that everyone who walked through those doors knew that they were valued, no matter who they were. Tomorrow the work would begin, but today Andrea felt a small sense of hope, a sense that change was possible and that she was ready to lead her team to that better future. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dealership as Andrea walked into the showroom, ready to begin the next phase of her plan. She had spent the entire evening preparing for this moment. The meeting with her team was crucial. The changes she was about to implement would shape the future of the dealership, and it was time to see who would step up and who would fall behind. As she entered the showroom, Andrea saw that most of her staff had already gathered. They were standing in clusters, whispering quietly among themselves, probably discussing what had happened the day before. The tension in the air was palpable. This was no longer just about sales numbers or customer satisfaction. It was about the very heart of the business. It was about integrity, fairness, and respect. Andrea walked to the front of the room, her presence immediately commanding attention. She could see that some of the salespeople were still nervous, while others looked resigned. But she wasn't there to make anyone feel comfortable. She was there to make a change. "Good morning, everyone," Andrea began, her voice steady. "I'm glad to see you all here. I know that yesterday was a difficult conversation, but today we start fresh. Today we begin the real work of changing the culture here at this dealership." The room was quiet, and Andrea could feel everyone's eyes on her. She paused for a moment, letting the silence settle before continuing. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "This dealership is not just about selling cars. It's about creating an environment where everyone who walks through that door, no matter who they are, what they look like, or where they come from, feels welcome. It's about respect, and I will not stand by and let anyone be treated as less than that. Not under my watch." She paused, looking around at the faces in front of her. She could see a few people nodding, and that gave her hope. There was a spark there, a glimmer of understanding. But she knew that words alone wouldn't change anything. It was time for action. "I've brought in a consultant who specializes in diversity and inclusion," Andrea continued. "Over the next few weeks, we will be going through intensive training sessions. We will be learning how to recognize bias, how to engage with customers fairly, and most importantly, how to build relationships based on trust and respect." Andrea could see the skepticism in some faces. Change wasn't easy, especially when it required deep introspection and hard conversations. But Andrea wasn't here to coddle anyone. She was here to help them grow. "We will also be implementing a system of accountability," Andrea said. "If you fail to treat customers with the respect they deserve, there will be consequences. This is not optional. If you can't get on board with this, if you can't commit to being part of the change, then maybe this isn't the place for you." The room was still, but Andrea could see the wheels turning in some of their minds. She wasn't just talking about policies, she was talking about culture. She was talking about making this dealership a place where every person, regardless of their race, background, or appearance, felt valued. "And I'm also making one more change," Andrea added. "I'm going to personally meet with every employee over the next few weeks one-on-one. I want to hear from you. I want to know what you think about these changes and how we can make them work. This is not just my dealership, it's yours too. And if we're going to make this work, we need to be in it together." She looked around the room one last time, her eyes meeting each person's. "I want to build something better, something that we can all be proud of, but I can't do it alone. So let's get to work. Let's make this dealership the best it can be, not just in terms of sales, but in terms of how we treat people." The room was quiet for a moment, and then slowly, one of the salespeople, an older man named Frank, raised his hand. Andrea nodded toward him. "Frank," she said, "I just wanted to say, I get it. I've been here a long time, and maybe I didn't realize how things were coming across. But I'm in. I'll do whatever it takes to help make this place better," Frank said, his voice steady but sincere. Andrea smiled. "Thank you, Frank. I appreciate that. And I know this won't be easy, but together we can make it happen." The others began to nod, murmuring their agreement. Andrea could see that her words were starting to sink in. The change was happening, right here, right now. After the meeting, Andrea left the showroom feeling a sense of cautious optimism. She had a long road ahead of her, but she knew that this was the right path. Her dealership was going to change, not just for the betterment of the business, but for the customers who relied on it. As Andrea made her way outside, she glanced across the lot. The sun was high in the sky now, and the heat of the day had started to kick in. But Andrea didn't mind. She had made the decision to step up, to lead with integrity, and to create a culture where everyone, every single person, felt respected and valued. She walked past her old truck, the one she had used to sneak in undercover, and felt a small sense of pride. She had made it this far, And now it was time to see the real work begin. The change she had envisioned wasn't just about policy, it was about transforming hearts and minds. And she was ready for that challenge.